Thank you to my sponsors, Kukin and Windsor One. Got Dave right there. If you need any Windsor product, there's your man right there. We appreciate them being here and helping us host this thing. Talking about Greek revival this week, so should be a fun time. I ruptured a disc in my back, so I'm going to hobble a little bit. So, and if I a lot of drugs, so if I start slurring, you know, that's why I can't drink beer tonight. Okay, Greek revival, 1820 to 1860, right? We are kind of in this period right here. We're just after the federal era. Remember, we started with Georgian, federal, 1780 to 1820-ish, and now we are in the Greek revival era. Tonight, we're going to kind of talk about why Greek culture and history became so important and people wanted to follow it. We'll talk about the styling of it and what it looks like. We're going to study a guy named Asher Benjamin. Everybody heard of Asher Benjamin? 2, 3, 2. He's my builder this month. He's the guy that I want to study as far as a master builder, what he did, why he's significant and special. And then as far as the lost art of building, we're going to do ironwork. We're going to talk about ironwork. So should be a fun little discussion. America in 1840, okay? Our population's swelling, about 17 million now. We have 26 states in the Union. New York, you know, at this point is still the largest city and continues to be the largest city in our country. Our country is expanding west, okay? So as you can imagine, with 26 states instead of 13, we've doubled in size. We are moving west. We are kind of in an interesting time period. The Greek revival period is kind of the last of the handmade era. And so we are beginning to see industrialization. Now, next talk is on early Victorian stuff, and we'll talk about what manufacturing, you know, steam planing mills, cut nails, you know, moldings that you can buy from a machine instead of making by hand, what all of that starts to do to building and how it affects things. So, but we're kind of the end of that era, end of the handmade era, end of the classical era. We got balloon framing happen. We'll talk about that next time. So before this period, balloon framing is thought to be invented in the 1840s, 1850s. Essentially, everything used to be timber framed, and now it's made of small sticks. And it was called balloon framing as a derogatory term. It looks like a balloon that's going to blow away. This house can't stand this way. So craftsmanship is really changing in this time period. The architects and kind of who they are and their importance is rising. So as the craftsmen, as we move away from a handheld era, the architects begin to take their place as the kind of the designers and engineers for modern cities. So we'll be looking at that. This is the U.S. in 1840, right? We recognize this half, we don't recognize this half. The states aren't fully there yet. We just have 26 of them. Here's the top 10 states. We've got 3 that are Albany, Brooklyn, and of course New York City. So a lot of growth happening there. 312,000 in New York at this point. There was 60,000 in 1800, 14,000 in 1780, or it was 1760. Realize Philadelphia used to be our biggest city. Now it's number 4. New Orleans has grown, Baltimore has grown. These are all port cities, very important. And you see Charleston, I think was 9 or 10, is 10, 29,000. Isn't growing as fast down there. Major ports become New York and New Orleans. So how the country's going. Greek revival is really about this, okay? It's about, this is the Parthenon rebuilt in Nashville. This is the Parthenon in Greece. Now, what happens is that there is as our country's growing and as we get older, there is a number of things that we begin to think about ourselves as a nation, right? We begin to think, hey, this experiment of democracy might work. Realize that when we, got out of when we rebelled against England, The whole concept of self-rule, of democratic rule, was pretty radical. Everybody had a king right at that point. No one was ruled democratically. And so, this now, 40, 50 years after that time period, we're looking around, hey, this might work. There is a growing exuberance for this experiment, okay, that was American democracy. And we began to kind of, hey, this might work. So the Greek Revival is not only a stylistic thing based on Greek temples, but it is definitely a philosophical acceptance and enamoration with who we are, what we're becoming. Many people, in doing my research for this thing, are saying that this is kind of our first national style, our first, the first American style. We borrowed styles from from England, particularly. Think Georgian, King George. Federalism is really Adamesque, okay, so that's also from England. And so there's a number of things happening that are going on. Now, last time we talked about the neoclassical era, right? That Robert Adam had gone to Pompeii. They had realized that what they were building and what they were looking at wasn't what they had been building, were the exterior buildings. They see the interior of a Roman house and they go, oh, we've been building our buildings all wrong. So we begin to see a neoclassicism, okay? The Greek Revival is just a continuation of that, okay? It's a continuation of a change in thinking, a change in the way we design that's kind of moved away from that Roman model. Now, there's a number of things that happened with the Greek Revival that really started, and we'll talk about in 1762, as other countries especially looked at Greece and realized that that's the mother of Rome. Okay, that's where Rome got their architecture. That's where they got their gods. That's where they got their thinking. That's where they got everything. We should be looking to Greece. Now, the reason they couldn't go there was because of the Ottoman Empire. But there are it's kind of a fun story. This book, Antiquities of Athens. Okay, this is a copy of it. You're welcome to come look through it. But basically, this society of gentlemen who had been on a grand tour got together and said, we need to go check out and draw these Greek temples. And they basically sneak into the Ottoman Turk Empire, right? You can see it here, right? So the Ottoman Turks, at one point controlled all of this area. And here's Greece and Athens down here. Here's the Macedonian coast, right? But they basically have taken this whole thing over. There's a number of, things that are happening here that make us aware of Greek culture. One is this book, but the other one is this temple in southern Italy, okay, Temple of Pastum, was a group of temples that they discovered in the early mid-1700s. And they said, what is this? These aren't Roman temples. This isn't Roman. These have been abandoned. Oh, these are Greece. Okay, these are Greek. And so this is what a Greek temple looked like. And we'll see that this became very popular. So these guys, Stuart and Rivette, which is who's on this, sneak into Greece and start drawing the temples, okay? They go in about 1750. Realize our Greek Revival doesn't start till 1820. So we're talking 70 years before that. Part of this is that, information travels really slow at this period. There is no Instagram. And when this book first came out, the subscribers to this were not really architects and builders. They were, thinkers, and they were, gentlemen architects and things like that. So this book, 1762, they write this book, Antiquities of Athens, and it is a study of Athens architecture. This temple, Pastum in southern Italy, was discovered in about the same period. Another thing that happens culturally is we have the war with Britain, the War of 1812. And it really sours American ideas to doing anything associated with Britain, right? They came, they burned down our capital, kind of, a black eye. Why would we want to take design direction from these guys? So this is another piece of why we start embracing Greek Revival. And then there's a Greek War of Independence in 1821. where the Greece actually breaks away from the Ottoman Turks. Now, this was a very popular war. It was a viral war, if there was such a thing. You know, the French artist Delacroix got involved in this and was painting pictures for the revival, or for the war. Lord Byron, the English poet, he actually goes and fights there and ends up dying in the Greek War of Independence. And so there's a lot of buzz going on about this. There's a lot of buzz about Greece, a lot of buzz about design and how this works. And so Greek Revival is a style that's building in America. These are some of the prints that come back from the Stewart and Rivette book, where it shows this is the Parthenon, right? And they built these temples and other things inside them that you don't see those now. In fact, this picture here, right, is the Parthenon. So when he drew that in 1750-60, there was all kinds of building and stuff going on inside the Parthenon that has since been removed. This is the Temple of Theseus, just another Greek temple. But this becomes the design ideal, as you'll see, for design. This is Piranesi, very famous engraver and artist. He drew this in 1778. Again, it's the newspaper of the day, right? These popular prints come out, and again, more fascination with the Greek style. So, what are the details? What makes it up? Temple front, this strong temple front that we'll see, the porches and gable ends, they mimic little Greek temples. The moldings for this period are really heavy, strong, bold. They're not dainty like the French or the Federal. They are stone-like, okay? And you'll see kind of really heavy massing as these moldings and details are put together. You'll see that these rooms are pretty plain, okay? There's large bases, large casings, but there aren't full paneled walls. There aren't really decorative overmantels on mantels. You'll see the mantels being very simple and clean. And then the columns will have no base. There'll be a fluted column that runs right down to the ground, and we'll see the difference of that. Now I have, say this caveat, I am not a history teacher, okay? I studied history and English in college. I love it. I'm a builder, okay? So sometimes I'll get comments like, well, that didn't technically right. Look, guys, I'm just sharing what I'd love to know. I've used all these books to help pull all this information together. This stuff right now, this Field Guide to American Houses, Virginia McAllister, when I went to North Bennett Street, this was our Bible for what styles look like. A lot of these slides currently come from this book. So if you want to understand different architectural styles, you start with that. Bill, this is a fantastic book. I just finished reading it. It's the only book on Asher Benjamin there is. And Asher Benjamin is this really influential builder. He was, I guess, and it still is, one of my building heroes because of his ability to design and craft and do everything else. Bill Renaro is the author. I think he's watching. Bill, if you're watching, great book. And then here are some of the original pattern books, okay? We'll talk about Asher Benjamin, but this is an Asher Benjamin pattern book, 1826. So you can see these leather-bound books if you want to come look through those. There's another one, Bernard Lefevre. So there's where my research is coming from, and that's where it's come from. So this Greek style, okay? And so you'll see gable ends on federal houses and Georgian houses, but you don't see this entablature that drops down as part of this Greek Revival era. These porches, the columns, there's no base on those columns the way they sit down on the ground like that. A lot of these houses were remodels with kind of Greek Revival porches or Greek Revival entry. A bunch of details. See these header details that go over the top of a door and window? Very different from the Georgian things you would see. Again, were influenced by that temple front. We're going to look at a few entries. They're very unique in that the face of the building's here, and they're often set back a couple feet inside, where these columns will sit in front of the door like this. Side lights and transoms that are square. Remember, in the Federal period, we had the elliptical fan lights. That's no longer there. We've transitioned into the Greek Revival. This is Andalusia. It was actually a remodel. Owen Biddle, who you'll see, it was a bank director, redid his house. Fluted columns, Greek Doric fluted columns that go right down to the base. This strong temple front, that full entablature, right? You see, this is a Doric order here with the triglyphs and the guttae and all that different stuff. This is a very important. You see inside the house, you've got a full entablature running around this room, right? Notice there's not a lot of movement in those moldings, and so what you're looking at is this would be like a Greek Revival entablature. If this is that room, right? What's happening is they just do step, step, and then they'll do a crown, okay? But these moldings are just really flat boards, and so if you wanted to reproduce these moldings, it's not hard to do, and you get a real strong impact. The other thing you'll see on the ceiling is that the molding might come down and do this. This your Safa, the Corona, it comes up like this, and it'll come down, and so you're going to see that undercut. And then, of course, there's a Greek molding here. So bed mold, Corona, cimation, same kind of buildup in your cornice, but I'm going to show you this kind of cut back. It's here in this room here where it cuts back. Notice the pilasters in the wall. These are all very typical Greek Revival details.
Brent,
yeah?
Those moldings plaster or wood?
Wood. So, well, I say that. That house is wood. Where you get into some of these cornices where there's this egg and dart and leaf and dart, that's most likely plaster up here. This cornice would have been too easy to make in wood for them to make it in plaster, but these repeating patterns and repeating moldings, a lot of plaster. This would definitely have been plaster, right? And so it's a combination of things in here. Yeah, and by the way, any questions, just stop me and raise your hand. Again, Greek Revival, you'll see these ceilings like this, heavy plaster decoration. This little palmette or honeysuckle anthimmon is a very typical Greek detail. You see it over these cabinets on top here, but even the moldings and even that decoration is kind of heavy and thick. Again, these rooms are simple, right? There's a base molding, there's a crown, okay? That other crown had a full entablature. This one's just a cornice at the top. Very simple mantle, right? Very, very simple and clean. But these are typical Greek Revival rooms. Now, comparing, here's Georgian, here's Federal, here's Greek Revival, right? The Georgian is heavier, more active, okay? There's the entablature here and how it's built up is obviously very nice. Federal, very dainty and clean. They've exaggerated that frieze there, and they've got the swags and the urns, which is all part of that. And then, of course, this is our Greek Revival. Bases are really pretty tall. They stick out from the wall. The Greek key detail here. You kind of see these tastes changing. Still classical, but expressed differently. Georgian, Federal, Greek Revival. Look how simple this mantle. It's a mantle shelf. There's a molding there, straight molding, and then just a big frieze there. They've got a Greek key design going in. You see these with rounded columns and without, but typical Greek Revival. This is an entry, right? Again, we see these heavy details, this kind of column detail and this kind of decoration, very typical. Full entablature, very heavy and bold back there. This is the second bank of Philadelphia, William Strickland we'll talk about. Notice the columns that go down to the ground. This one is made of stone. This is another William Strickland building in Nashville where he moves at the end of his career. Notice, this one has square piers. Sometimes you'll see square piers on the end and then round in the middle. Like at this house, this is in Macon, Georgia. You got square, columns on the outside, round in the middle. And then I've blown up this doorway here, right? It's set back a foot or so. You've got kind of these columns inset inside this porch. This, again, is a very typical detail that we'll see over and over again, a motif in that Greek Revival. This is Robert Mills, very strong Greek Revival, fluted columns running down to the base. This is a house in Ashley, New York. See the palmette details there. Full entablature as it wraps the house here. And then there's the Wade House. So again, this, if we didn't have this, right, that could be any kind of typical, vernacular federal or even Georgian house. But the fact that this sticks out, the fact that you have the full entablature, this kind of shutter detail or window light pattern in that large frieze is pretty typical. Notice the square columns, the piers as they're called. So again, Greek Revival details. So, any questions about Greek Revival? What that looks like? Yeah.
What about in Texas? I know Greek Revival was popular in Texas. There's a great collection of homes in Austin that Edward Cook built. Are there other examples around the state?
Well, yeah, I mean, and there is there is no doubt. And if you look at kind of America, right, we're moving this way. And if we're looking at the years 1820 to 1860, Texas doesn't become a state till 1845. Almo's 1836. And so the last part of the Greek Revival would be, if this is Texas, this is a bad Texas, but that part of Texas, East Texas, you see a lot of it. There's a lot of stuff in St. Augustine. Got a client with some parents who live in St. Augustine, but the east side of Texas is going to have a lot more Greek Revival than Dallas or Fort Worth. And so we just don't have the settlement here. But yeah, there is a good collection of Greek Revival in Texas. It's early stuff. Any other questions? Yeah.
So where's the precedence for like square column holding up a second story balcony on the front of the home, and then you have maybe fluted or round columns on the second story, right? So,
well, if you dig into Stewart and Rivette's book, and I won't do it right now, but I can show you after, all of the details that you see on like a detail like that. One of the other things, Windsor right now, we're working on a Greek Revival package. We're talking about, no, that's not a door. We're talking about the door, and in the Greek Revival tradition, you actually have these splayed jambs, and then sometimes a little pediment over top. This actually comes from the side of the Parthenon. The different drawings on the sides of the Parthenon, there's some splayed jamb. There's a porch detail with those square columns engaged and round columns in the middle. So it's coming from Greek precedent, and that's where that's coming from.
and that would include like maybe all rounded columns on the bottom, right? Holding up your second story balcony and then the square on the top, or vice versa.
Correct.
Kind of the same.
Yeah, and realize too that in some cases, he's asking about square and round columns, in case you didn't hear, and kind of where that precedent came from. There is inventiveness from individual builders who would do things. And one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about Asher Benjamin was the influence of his books and them appearing in Mississippi and in other parts that he's a New England guy, and them seeing his books and interpreting and changing things based on what their needs were. So it's some precedent. What you're describing may be a builder kind of, getting outside of his lane.
Is that right, though?
I just have to see it. Yeah. I just have to see it. It's all in the execution. If the proportions and scale are right, then yeah, you can sell that. That Wade house had square columns over square columns. In the classical sense, typically those columns shrunk down. You had bigger columns carrying the weight. You don't see that as much in the Greek Revival. So, is it right? Is it wrong? It's
but integrating the two.
Integrating the two is fine. Absolutely fine. Yeah. Yes, Alice.
Do you mind repeating that question for people online?
Yep. So, yeah, if you've got questions online, please just text them in, Alice, or type them in. Alice will throw something at me and we'll figure it out. What he's asking about is square and round columns on a porch or over top combined together, square over round, just kind of what the precedent was and kind of how that worked. And so I was saying that it had to do with historic precedent that they would have seen in a book like Stewart and Rivette and or Asher Benjamin as he came out with things later on. So our design influences in this period, okay? Benjamin Latrobe is really kind of the big dog here. Strickland and Mills study under Benjamin Latrobe. Asher Benjamin, he's our master builder in this era. He has a student, Ithiel Town. Thomas Walter is not a guy we're going to study this time, but he's part of this whole ring. James Hoban in the White House, who designed the White House. I told you before that we begin a period where the architect is rising in prominence. And so they have a more important role. And before this time, if you remember when I talked about Charles Bulfinch, it was a tragic story, supremely talented guy, but couldn't make a dime, right? And so it was really tough to be an architect in America, you know, pre-1800. Latrobe comes to America in around the 1790s. He is a European-trained Grand Tour engineer and architect who is uber qualified, okay? And that's fairly rare. We're going to look at Washington, D.C. and see how all these guys play together to have an influence on our growing capital and why that matters. But Latrobe is the big dog. He trains Mills and Strickland, who go out and promote the Greek Revival. It should be noted that a lot of these guys are designing in the Gothic Revival as well. Next time we're going to talk about where Gothic Revival fits, but it comes from the same guys. It's not like Strickland only did Greek Revival, he also did Gothic Revival, and same with Benjamin Latrobe. So, civic architecture, okay? There really isn't civic architecture. I mean, there is the Boston State House, these state houses that they were building was civic architecture. But on a grand scale, like what was happening in Washington, D.C., where you're city building, right? So 1790, they decided to move to Washington, and from then, really until after the Civil War, they are rebuilding this city, or building and rebuilding this city. I think what I'm trying to do is tie together the building of Washington with the rise of the architect as a influential kind of leader in design. If you look at, you know, the Capitol building, it was a contest to see who could come up with a good design. There really weren't good designs, and then William Thornton kind of comes in late and designs the White House, and they're like, oh, okay, well that one's good enough, right? So here you are in the 1790s not really having a good design available, not really having good designers. And so it's kind of crazy to think that there just weren't professional architects in America at that time. The White House is designed by James Hoban. He's an Irish architect who comes here. And then the Washington Monument is Robert Mills, obviously a student. If you look at the architects of the Capitol, okay, and these were the guys that Jefferson and Madison and some of these other presidents are appointing to roles to help them build the city. William Thornton, obviously an amateur, he's first. Benjamin Latrobe, he is very qualified. He complains about Thornton's drawings all the time. They're saying, no, just keep going. He wanted to change it, and he said, no, we're not changing it, just make it work. Remember, talked about Charles Bulfinch. After the War of 1812, he ends up there because Latrobe pisses people off, and they push him out of the way. Bulfinch is in there for almost 15 years. Robert Mills, there's a break between this. Robert Mills is there, and then Thomas Walter is another European-trained architect. We'll talk about him, but you're seeing the who's who of American designers in Washington, D.C. That's a place they can go and make money. That's the place they can go and have a steady salary as supervisor of the works or whatever else. And so, that's where they ended up. This is Thornton's original design, 1793. Latrobe took over. The British burned it in 1814. I wonder why that's not showing up on there. And then this is Bulfinch. When he got there, he had designed a new dome, okay, not this dome. He had another dome. This is 1846. And so you see this changing, okay? By 1850, now because of the expansion of the states, we're, 3 times as big as when they started, and so they had to completely redo the Capitol. This is Thomas Walter. Notice what they're doing here. They are making a new dome, and this is all out of steel, okay? So think about that the Capitol was originally a timber framed building, okay? And so when they doubled it in size, they began to use more modern materials like steel, and the engineering required changes the dynamics of what a good architect could be, and changes the dynamics of how they're doing this. And so this is the dome that we're used to seeing, made out of cast iron, and how things change. And this is the 30-year period, right? So Bulfinch was there until 1830, and this is 20 years after Bulfinch's leaves. So it's a pretty dramatic change that's taking place. It speaks to how design is changing and the needs for design are changing. As we go farther into the early 1900s, the rise of the architect. I mean, realize at this time there's no architecture schools, right? There aren't architecture schools in America until like 1870, 1880. MIT was the first one, then Columbia. So it's early. AIA, we're going to talk about it later, isn't a group yet. What? Did you say something?
I do have a question about that. So
Yeah.
you're integrating these different architects during the build. So this is almost like maybe the start of an actual design build concept, right? Like you're designing it while you're building it, or that changes, you bring on another architect. Is that kind of how that would work? Or when these architects step back, then it's...
Yeah, the question is this a design build situation where they're kind of designing as they go? Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, no. Basically, that's what Latrobe wanted to do. Okay, when Latrobe saw this design, he says, so that's inadequate. That won't work. I want to change this. And Jefferson was just like, enough. We're going forward with this design, realizing that redesign was going to take forever, right? And so they are working off each other's plans, but you begin to see how they change, right? They have the fire. He gets an opportunity to come in and rebuild. He offers a better dome than this dome, and of course they end up with this dome, 20 years later. Still working off the same plan. I think part of it is they're growing so fast that there's just like, probably their, hairs are on fire, their asses are catching and kind of thing. It's just, we just got to get going. We got to keep building. And so this was 1861 before Lincoln's inauguration. So yeah, fast. Any other questions on that? So Latrobe, this is him, a handsome gentleman. He's often called the father of American architecture. He is, because he's kind of the first professional one. You think Bulfinch, he was also an architect, wasn't trained like Latrobe was trained. He did a grand tour. He studied in Europe. When he first gets, I think I told it last time, when he first gets to the U.S., he has all kinds of trouble in Virginia. He's trying to build a prison. He's trying to use standard, I think I talked to you last time about in Europe they would get 5% for building a house, for building a building like this, 2.5% for design, 2.5% for overseeing construction. He was trying to implement that in America, and it just fell flat on its face. And so he was having a really difficult time staying busy and staying active because of the fees that he was wanting and everything else. He becomes the surveyor of the public buildings. That's a real steady job and allows him a lot of work. He ends up making people mad, and he ends up getting booted, and that's when they brought Bulfinch in. He was an engineer. He did help with canals. You'll read about these guys designing hospitals and prisons and doing canals and engineering work and the locks. So it reminds me almost of like Da Vinci or Michelangelo when they were designing forts, and they were doing military works and things like that. If you were a designer, you were able to use it in a number of different ways. So this is his first building in the Bank of Philadelphia, a Greek Revival building. Notice that year, 1798, right? The Greek Revival doesn't really start till 1820, right? This is the first Greek Revival building in America. It gets torn down, I think, 1850. But significant, that's where Benjamin Latrobe started. Baltimore's Merchant Exchange, 1821. These merchant exchanges were hotels, they were business centers, they were like a convention center, okay? And we'll find out later that Asher Benjamin tried to do one in Boston, it didn't stand. Basically, they had to tear it down. He lost his reputation because that building went so poorly. This was a very important building. It would have been like building a convention center. There was places for trade, places for business showing your wares, all kinds of things like that. It was a very important building. Again, the engineering required to build something like this is quite a feat. This is considered his masterpiece. This is in Baltimore. This is the Baltimore Basilica. A beautiful building, well executed, beautiful design. Robert Mills is one of his students, right? Robert Mills is most famous for the Washington Monument, the big oblique that was done in Washington. He starts in South Carolina. He starts working for James Hoban. Then he goes apprentices with Latrobe for a number of years. This guy was probably the most commercially successful architect at the time. At the same time, he was always losing money. He was always in debt. And so it wasn't a great way to make a living in architecture at this time. But for him to be the most successful one and still go through bouts where he's looking for cash speaks to the profession of architecture. He worked in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and South Carolina, and then of course DC. You'll see a number of buildings from all over. This was in New Bedford, strong Greek revival. Temple front, the columns are not fluted, but this is a very austere, strong building, which is what that Greek revival promotes. This is a courthouse in South Carolina. He did 17 courthouses in South Carolina. Again, this temple front, strong temple front, very appropriate. He was also, as on the engineering side, big into fireproofing. That was kind of one of his things, and we'll make it fireproof. Remember, making things fireproof was a big deal. You had fires burned down whole cities. So this was the fire building in 1828. It's now the South Carolina Historical Society, but strong Robert Mills design. In Washington, D.C., he did the General Post Office in 1828. You notice the temple fronts coming across here, full entablature running around. Very elegant building. This is the inside of the patent office. Good details in there. It's known today the Smithsonian has taken it over. So what was the patent office is now the Smithsonian. But you can see his designs and those things coming together. Very strong style, right? Very, very bold, very, very majestic. This is, he did two monuments. This is the Baltimore Washington Memorial. He did in 1829. This was his design for the Washington Monument, okay? It was considered too expensive, but wouldn't that have been a beautiful addition instead of this? Now this, it almost looks modern, right? It's just so clean and austere. The thing about this, I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but about this way up, basically they started that in 1845, ran out of money for a number of years. Then the Civil War happened, and it sat like this at that height until it was finished in 1885. So the difference in color between those things is because they stopped it. They had to get a new quarry, 30 years later to go up the rest of the way. So would have been pretty magical to have that design. Notice that strong Greek design with those fluted Doric columns. But yeah, it was too expensive, and so they cut it back. It just speaks to me how, young our country was, and we just didn't have money, right? We were trying to do kind of some cool things, but we couldn't afford ourselves. And so it's interesting to me hearing these stories, unable to get paid, and coming up with designs that aren't able to be built because they're just too expensive. William Strickland is the third architect, the one that studied underneath of Latrobe and was, new mills. They ended up competing against each other quite a bit. And realized too that when Strickland and Mills start winning commissions, they're winning them from Latrobe. And so it's not a real, it's a very competitive atmosphere. And he, in fact, on the Second Bank of Philadelphia, which is here, he actually was competing against Latrobe for that and won it. And that would have been really annoying, right? If you trained those guys up and how to build and then they win this job from you. either because they're cheaper or whatever else. So he was a student of Latrobe as well. He was an engineer as well. He did some train stuff, so not only canals, but he also did some train work and helped people, early steam engines and stuff like that. His best work is in Philadelphia and Nashville. This is, of course, that Second Bank of Philadelphia. If you go there and you go to the Liberty Bell, this is right around the corner from that, right by Carpenter's Hall. It's a great building. You need to check it out. This was another merchants exchange, right? These are important buildings in Philadelphia. 1832 in Rhode Island, the Providence Athenaeum. Here's that porch design I was talking about that you'll see on front doors, where the porch is set inside. This one doesn't have the piers on the side, but at the round columns in the middle. But this is a very typical Greek Revival element and detail. He moves to Tennessee. He goes through bankruptcy, like a lot of these guys, and ends up going to Tennessee for a job, ends up designing the state capitol there. Very handsome, beautiful building. And then shout out to my daughter, went to Belmont University, and this is the Belmont Mansion. Again, you see this design motif where that porch is inset. There's the square column. This is the Corinthian order, a little bit higher style, but a good Greek Revival building built in that period. It's now part of Belmont University. Any questions on those guys? So, you know, these are our design guys. We're really seeing the face of change that's happening in architecture and design as the strength of engineering credits end up kind of, you know, lifting these guys up. This is the rise of the big city and the fall of the master builder. So, you know, I say that with a little bit of a hard heart because I don't like seeing that. I feel like there's a loss of craftsmanship. And my heroes, Buckland, Samuel McIntyre, and Asher Benjamin, we just don't, there's no need for those guys anymore. Okay, so Asher Benjamin. Asher Benjamin was, I think it was hard to be a builder in this era. I think it was hard to do things. He's a very inspirational person because he really understood and got design very quickly. He's most famous for the books he wrote. Okay, and that's how I knew about him when I was at North Bennett Street. He wrote 7 books. There was 45 editions written from those books. 2 of the books were very popular. He's in this section. He's you know, dies in 1845, but he's in this section because of his writing for the Greek Revival style. Now, ironically, the Greek Revival style, he wasn't very good at it. We're going to see a couple of his buildings where he just didn't execute them very well. He loved, I shouldn't say loved, he admired Charles Bulfinch. Bulfinch was his hero. Bulfinch was the guy who could do no wrong. And so he follows and looks around at Bulfinch and what Bulfinch did, and then ended up copying that. You'll see in his early design he had, and I guess as I realized he was carving as well, that all of these guys, all of the good guys in the 17 and 1800s, the good carpenters and craftsmen knew how to carve. Now I take that from 3 individuals, but it seems like such an archaic, lost art, but it really was something that these guys practiced and knew how to do, and he was included in that. He is the first American pattern book author, and so he has an incredible amount of influence all around the country. And I've got him broken down in kind of 3 eras. His early career, and then Boston, the mid-career, and then kind of a late career. This is the Connecticut River Valley. I stole a lot of this stuff from Bill's book, so Bill, thank you, but you get the full credit. I'm excited because I always wanted to know about Asher Benjamin, and Bill finally wrote that book during the COVID, so if there's blessings for COVID, that's one of them. Anyway, so it's a wonderful book. He's born in Hartland, Connecticut, and ends up working in Suffield, but he ends up living for the first, until 1883, almost 30 years. He's working in this Connecticut River Valley. That goes from Massachusetts up to Vermont and New Hampshire. He basically travels in this era and realized that the best building in the country was happening in Boston and Philly and Charleston and things like that. The best building was not happening in the Connecticut River Valley. It wasn't as advanced, they were backward, and he starts working here. This is the Otis Phillips house. This was an addition that was put on the outside. This is in Connecticut. We know he carves these Ionic capitals. That's kind of his first job and first claim to fame that ends up helping him build a body of work. But these capitals were here. Now, interestingly, this is at Winter Tour, and this is the room from that house. It's called the Federal Parlor at Winter Tour. We studied it last time, and they had always said at Winter Tour that Asher Benjamin did this room. And I talked to Bill, he's not sure. It's unclear exactly what Asher did, but this is the room at Winter Tour that I've known for 15, 20 years now and never associated with this house, but that was the inside of this house. So he was a fairly wealthy merchant. He designs and builds this house. I mean, a very sophisticated federal style room in this period. This is early 1800s, 1790. And so he also did this circular staircase at the State House in Hartford. So these two pieces were his kind of first rise at the party. So evidently he was a very skilled craftsman, right? To be able to carve the columns, assuming he did some of that work inside, and then to do a circular stair, is impressive. He was looking at pattern books. I got one from William Payne here that he was looking at. He was learning from the past. He was looking at the books that those guys had sent out, and he ends up kind of building his name and reputation on these two projects, and he kind of moves from there. I told you that Bullfinch was one of his heroes. This is a Bullfinch Church in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It's now been torn down. I think it was a fire. Asher was a traveler. He was a learner. He was always moving around trying to figure things out. And his book, his first book, ends up including this church design in it. Now, we think he stole a lot of this was inspired by Bullfinch, but this was the design, and then this is a church in Bennington, Vermont, where we think he got, the design was taken from Benjamin's pattern books. So, yeah.
Is Winter there, is that like where somebody actually lived, or is that always just been a museum?
This?
Winter there?
Yeah. He asked what Winter Tour is. What's the deal with Winter Tour? Winter Tour is the DuPont family home. Okay, so it was his house for a long time, and then he kept expanding it as he bought historic rooms. And so he had dealers and guys going out around the country buying rooms, and he found that Phelps house. They bought the parlor out of that house, and they installed it at Winter Tour. And so he did that with Philadelphia houses. He did that with New Hampshire taverns. If you want to go on a fun trip, if you're a millwork geek like you and I, you need to go there. It is like Mecca, right? It's just, you're going to go there. I just talked to one of my representatives there. I think we're going to go shoot video there and comparing federal and Georgian rooms and how things were built originally. So it should be really exciting. But Winter Tour, if you're into architectural interiors, you can walk from a Georgian room to a federal room, from New Hampshire to Boston to Philadelphia to New York, and just, it's crazy. 175 rooms at Winter Tour, 1640 to 1860. It's all that handmade era. It's a magical place. You need to go. So that's where Winter Tour is. What I bring this up, though, is because his books, and I think Bill said in his book that someone counted about 60 churches, okay, these are meeting houses and churches, that can be attributed to Asher Benjamin's pattern book, right? So it was an incredibly influential book. And one of the geniuses of Asher Benjamin is because he grew up in that Connecticut River Valley, he understood the challenge of being a country builder. And one of his other books is The Country Builder's Assistant. That was not meant to be derogatory. It was meant to be helpful. And he basically took very complex ideas and made them simple and executable for the average carpenter. Because the average carpenter was looking around going, they didn't travel. People didn't really travel back then. He traveled quite a bit. But he he was a teacher, right? And he was a guy who wanted to share in simple terms how to build these things, and his books were incredibly popular. This is the Old South Congregational Church. Again, one of Asher Benjamin's. This is from his book, and you see the likenesses and the details if you study those two. After he went all the way up that Connecticut River Valley, up to Windsor, Vermont. From there, he travels to Boston, and it's thought that he wanted to continue to be inspired, wanted to continue to learn, and so he goes there to be closer to his mentor, Charles Bulfinch. He starts an architectural school. It's one. We think he started one, or Bill thinks he started one in Vermont, but we know he started one we're pretty sure he started one in Boston. Ithiel Town, who's another pattern book author from Connecticut, studied under Asher Benjamin, we think at his school. But again, you see this heart for teaching and his heart for sharing what he knew. And so we think he had an architectural school in Boston. He had over 89 commissions in this period of time. And when he failed, he tried to build that merchant's building, and kind of all the work dried up. He started a paint store. And so, which is kind of interesting, right? He didn't really make a ton of money doing that, but we know that kind of to pay the bills and to get by, he did start a paint store. Right before he started, right in 1825, before he left to go work in New Hampshire, he did have to file for bankruptcy. So he seems like a lot of guys had to do that. So that are in the building trade. Bulfinch did, Asher Benjamin did. But his work in Boston is pretty significant. These are some of his churches and meeting houses that he was building there, beautifully designed and executed. And then in his latter career, after he went to New Hampshire, as kind of a building superintendent up there, he returns to Boston. And then in this 1830 edition, he finally starts to promote the Greek Revival. Now, realize what's happening is that his career's kind of dried up, but he sees the change the Greek Revival is having in the country. It would have started in the 1820s with the Greek War of Independence, and so he begins to put that in there. His book sales just kind of go through the roof, and by 1836, I think it's mostly Greek Revival stuff, and he begins to promote that. His most influential books actually promote Greek Revival. This is Quincy Market in Boston. He is thought to have helped with this thing. He wasn't the master builder who built it, but he was attributed to being either helping to design or consult. And then he was a part of an association called the American House Rights Society. Okay, they were early architects. They go to New York in the 1830s and start the AIA, okay, American Institute of Architects. It doesn't go anywhere. They don't really do anything. It's another 20 years before the AIA really starts. But Benjamin has changed from being that builder, house right, to being an architect full time, and he was recognized for being that at that time. This is one of the houses that, if I had said what style is that, I don't know if I would have looked at it and said, oh, that's Greek Revival. And this was the House of Waters House, 1829. He didn't build it, but he did design it. It's just kind of clunky. It's not real strong Greek Revival. You see the strong temple front out there, but these things seem to be clear holdovers of the swag from the federal era. And so it doesn't really scream Greek Revival. And this is where he kind of trips his way through his changeover from Greek Revival, really holding on strong to that federal thing, realizing the jobs aren't there. This was a very wealthy house. The execution of it is wonderful. It's just not, this real strong Greek Revival house. So here he had 7 books. Okay, his first one is 1797. He's 25 years old. And to think he wrote a book when he was 25. He apprentices for 5 to 7 years with a guy, and then 3 years into his career, he writes this book, which is kind of crazy. His next book comes out. This is his most popular book, 1806, and then the Practical House Carpenter, 1830. One of these two is his most popular book. it's interesting that the book sales depend on the number of plates he had. The more illustrations he had, the better the book sold. His last book, The Elements of Architecture, is almost a verbal discourse, doesn't sell well at all. But this book and its influence, right? Because these are the books I was reading when I went to North Bennett Street, trying to figure out how to build, trying to figure out what these guys knew. And I know I've talked about it with Craig at Windsor when we were coming up with their molding line. But if you think that one of his things that made him popular was that he simplified the building, you need to come look at these plates, okay? Because what he describes is how to make these moldings, how to strike these Greek Revival moldings, and how to build them with your plane, okay? So there's a lot of geometry in here. If I started reading these things to make a Grecian ovolo, you'd probably start glazing over if you aren't already glazing over. And so these are really complicated books. Richard, I don't even know if you can understand these things. And Richard's a great carpenter and craftsman, but they're thick, okay? And they're beautiful plates and everything else, and there's good designs and stuff. But when he describes how to do this, how to make a volute on a column, or how to build a stair, a circular stair, it's complex. It's thick, guys. And so it's one of the examples of how we've kind of fallen. We're not as good as we used to be. Lost art of building. The things, if this was the simplest books available at the time, ugh, I'm sorry. I'm in a bad place because I'm not sure I understand how he was laying these things out. So anyway, here's his books, and this is really the legacy of Asher Benjamin in my mind. This is what he did so well, and you can see some of the plates and some of the drawings. It's thought that he didn't do the drawings, didn't do all these drawings. He had one of his second books had a co-author who was thought did a bunch of these drawings and stuff, and so he was not always executing those things. What are the lessons that we can learn from Asher Benjamin? First of all, he started out very poor, and he was just a hard-working kid. He was a hustler. He was, any opening he had to make an acquaintance. When he got to Boston, when he left Windsor to go to Boston, he worked some relationships with some guys he had, really hustled his way into jobs. He was a traveler, and he didn't travel to Europe, but he traveled all over New England following Bullfinch, looking at different designs. Always a learner. He digested the William Payne, the English pattern books, and basically converted them for an American audience, converted for a country builder American audience. So he simplified the language enough so that guys could figure it out. His opportunity, his vision to be able to say, you know what people need in this area is a book on carpentry, is a book on building. I think that today, okay? I think there needs to be a book on building and architecture and trim that no one's writing and people don't know. And so we have to tell them, we have to help them. That's part of what these things are for. But his legacy is his writing, his teaching, and his sharing, and that's why he's one of my heroes. Any questions about him? I'm gonna take a water break. Almost done. So the last thing I want to talk about is the lost art of building is the metalwork and ironwork. And so I don't think there is a more expressive form of craftsmanship in America than ironwork, okay? Because, I mean, look at that, little cock's head, handle there. The variety and, will you get a book for me? On that wall, this wall, is that sewn book. It's about halfway. It's S-O-N-N. They're green books. They're right on the left side by that window. So these illustrations come from this three-part book called the Sewn Architecture Books, where they have gone back and documented and chronicled all these ancient ironworks and iron hardware. They're all charcoal drawn, pencil drawn things, so they're really beautiful. But the expressiveness of craftsmanship and form here, you don't see this kind of playfulness, you don't see this kind of fun that guys were having. So I love the ironwork and what it does. The most amazing part is the iron is where it starts in a swamp. Interesting, as I was reading out these things, they're saying that this the ironwork expressed the melting pot of American design because you see German influences, you see French influences, you see English influences, all happening and all expressed in this hardware and where it is. So it starts with bog ore, that's a piece of bog ore. And basically, when they first came to America, apparently the American iron and bog ore was really good. And what is bog ore? So basically in swamps and things like that, iron will come out of the rocks and down and fall into the water, okay? It collects on the leaves of plants, and as the plants die, then that iron stays together. And they're saying in like 3 to 5 years, maybe 15 years, it will replenish. So if you go down and you pick up one of these bog ores, and this is basically iron in a very polluted sense, okay? Thank you, Alice. I'm excited about these books because you need to know about them. You can probably buy one in Dover, but if you could get this set, then it would be a lot of fun. But they come in, there's 3 volumes, and Sohn was the author, but you'll see that he basically chronicles, and he goes through and he tells you where this was, where it was found. This is a swordfish design that you'll see. But the creativity and the beauty of how these things are drawn, all chronicling kind of where they were made, how they were made, who made them. They're beautiful books, so you need to check those out. And they have gates, and they've got all kinds of all the different hardware that we would see. So bog ore is a very polluted form of iron, and basically they will pull this up. The best iron in the world apparently was in Sweden because they had a lot of bogs, and that these bog ores would come out. What they do with that is then they put it into a very hot fire, and so they basically burn a lot of the impurities out of it. And once it gets down to some state, they convert it. There's 3 types. There's cast iron or pig iron, if you've ever heard that before. They basically melt it to a point, and it's not in a pure sense there. They'll pour it into a sand. They'll basically have a sand casted, thing with all these little chutes like this, and this little nipple that comes out. And so they say it's like they're pouring it into here, and it goes down and it hardens in cast iron form right here. And these are called little piglets, right? Just you're pouring from the main pig down to the little piglets there. And so that's the cast iron. Now cast iron would be things like iron backs in the fireplaces and things like that. That would have been kind of the cast iron and how they would have used that. There's wrought iron. We'll talk about the wrought iron. That's a purer form, right? What they do is they actually, once they melt it down, it's in pig form. They take the thing and they reheat it back up, and they start to work it, okay, or wrought it, and it becomes wrought iron. And then later, Bessemer steel is where they blow really hot air through the steel. It takes a lot of the impurities out. That's how we have modern steel. And so those are the 3 types. The wrought iron, it bugs me because people say, I want a wrought iron fence. Well, no one really gets a wrought iron fence anymore. There's wrought iron, the verb, and wrought iron, the noun, okay? So wrought iron is the thing, right? It's that purer form of cast iron that's been beaten and worked, okay? There's actually grain in that wrought iron. If it's broken apart, you can see these fibers and grains going in it. And so that stuff is really good. It's like sourdough bread. You know how you have to keep a piece of it so that you can make your next piece of sourdough bread? That's kind of what wrought iron's like. What? My wife's yelling. I think she's saying shout out to Doug Bracken for helping me work through that. Is that it? No. Doug Bracken's my iron guy, and he talked me through what wrought iron versus wrought iron is. So when people say I want a wrought iron fence, what they mean is they just want an iron fence. And so to actually get true wrought iron, which is very rust resistant and a wonderful, wonderful material that seems to be ageless, it's very difficult to get today. And so American iron is really good, okay? So remember when we were still a colony, one of the rules about us is that you couldn't produced. You could take raw materials. You had to send them back to England so they could be produced into something. So later we break that and we start to work our own iron and stuff like that. But they were taking bog ore back to, is one of the main shipping things that they were taking out of America at the time. So we'll start with architectural hardware. Realize that before they had this ironwork, early on, you might have a door with these. Those are wood hinges, okay? You had a wood latch. You might have a string that's how you lifted your latch, right? You might have a wood lock, okay? All those things were, you know, if you didn't have them and you needed them, how would you do it? You'd make it out of wood, right? So those were the earliest things. You'll see also leather hinges where things are just kind of hung on a leather hinge and thrown together. Certainly didn't swing like a modern door would swing. And then, anyway, so a lot of it was wood. Now iron, and you know, I always used to think it was folklore. I don't think it is anymore, that they would burn houses to get the nails. Nails were incredibly expensive. And what they would do is once they got the wrought iron made, they would make it into nail rods, which are basically a 1/4-inch rod. And it was almost a home industry for some people where they'd get nail rod and in the winter they'd make nails, right? And so nails were really expensive. They were all handmade. They were pointed. After you got the nail rod, they would point them and then they would do what's called a rose head on top of them. But people were making nails by hand at this time. And so it's not until the 1820s, 1830s you begin to have cut nails. Nails are very expensive. Screws are almost non-existent, okay, because screws are something you have to make by hand. You have to actually file all those, you know, that rotating deal into a screw. Imagine doing that. And so screws were very rare. So this hardware, as you'll see, here's what a forge would look like, were, you know, held on with nails, right? So they would nail them to the door, nail them onto the face of the thing, and very few of these things were screwed. I think I talked to you about cinch nails before, how they would drive a nail through and then turn it back on itself and cinch it together. It's how they kind of lock things together. The progression of hinges is that you've got strap hinges, mid-18th century. Next are H and L hinges. Now I've got one of my other iron companies that does ironwork, Heritage Metalworks. They make a lot of this stuff, and we've used this on jobs. But you begin to see these are strap hinges, right? The variety of decoration at the end of these little strap hinges is immense. But you see a bunch of different hinges here. This is an H hinge. An H and L hinge would be a hinge that went down and goes left, and we'll show you some of those in a sec. They become more popular. This kind of thing is called a rat tail hinge. This would have been used for cabinetry. And so this is a butterfly hinge or a dovetail hinge. So these were all the kind of things that were made and, you know, all secured with nails, not screws, the way things were made. This too, you'll see some variety in here on the locks as well. And the different lift handles, they did the different finishes. This was a lock, actually a very crude spring. See that? That's actually your spring, and it's actually how you open this. This is called an open face lock. There's another one on that door back there. That door in that frame right there is held in there with H hinges. And so that's kind of a typical arrangement of how that would have been done. And what you see is that there's this kind of bell curve where at first to have hinges would have been a sign of wealth, okay? And then as time goes on, having iron hinges was a sign that you were poor, and so they would want brass hinges and different and hidden hinges as time goes on. This would be some typical arrangements of how they would secure a door, how they would keep a door true. The way these doors were hung is literally that there was a pintail that was driven into the frame, and then these doors, these strap hinges are hung on that pintail, set inside that door, then they would have nailed it to that door, or they would have put it on there and then set it up there and put the pintail in. So, but those were, you know, hanging on very crude rods. Here's some of the pictures of the variety. They had bifold doors at this time, believe it or not. But the variety and ingenuity and expressiveness of these different hinges, I think, is awesome. These are called cock's head hinges here. See the little cock's head up there? And they would face in and out. These are the rat tail hinges I was talking about. And here's some rat tail hinges we used on a job in South Carolina. That was a fun job. And then as they started wanting to hide these things, they would, if you see that H hinge back there, instead of having the H hinge exposed on that piece of trim, they would hide it behind the trim. So the trim would go over that one side of that H, and they began to hide them. You see here, they put them in the edge of the door. And so it was a sign of kind of wealth and that they didn't want crude looking hinges. And then by 1830, 1850, they have cast butt hinges. Again, screws are very expensive. This was nailed in, right? So it's not until 1850, 60, 70 that you begin to see machine-made screws. The lashes sometimes were wood. Okay, this is one that has some metal surrounds. These rim locks, and I've got some examples here that you're welcome to come look at. One of the things that's interesting to me is it's a pretty thin metal. It's not real heavy. I'll pass these around. This is an European one. This is an American one, and you see how that's made. This is really cool example that shows kind of the texture and the feel of these plates and how they were nailed together or pinned and wedged together. So it's pretty awesome how they did this. Brass was really expensive. And so literally the way they would lay out a house is that on the entry you might see brass, and then going into a formal room you might see brass, but nowhere else in the house. And so brass was something that was just very expensive. Obviously a brass rim lock here with the job we did with a stirrup handle. So it wasn't always a knob, it was different kinds of handles and rings. But that's the kind of the progression where you have, string lock pushes, you have the iron, the Suffolk locks was what I was just showing you. Open face locks, and then rim locks. Basically it's an open face lock with a cover on top of it. With springs, and then the use of brass and iron. I think I went the wrong way. No. So again, here's that swordfish design I was telling you about. I was showing you that book, top and bottom. But again, just kind of fun, expressive ways for a blacksmith to create and show off his art. Called a Norfolk lock. When they have this flat plate, oftentimes it's machine made, or most of our hardware in early America was brought in from England, and so it wasn't until we got rid of that, the rule being a British colony, we couldn't make anything here, that we started making our own stuff. But you'll see this wide variety of open face locks, basically a spring holding these latches down so that it would open and close. Very ingenious and certainly a lot of fun. As far as gates and railings, the things like this, it's in some of the books are saying you see a lot more railing and that kind of work in New Orleans and Savannah and Charleston than you do in, say, Boston. There's just more of it down south. Philadelphia was pretty good. Maryland, there was some good stuff. But a lot of it happens in New Orleans and Charleston. If you've been to Charleston, you've seen the beautiful stuff. And they would do a mix of wrought iron and cast iron. So little bells or little medallions and stuff like that would be cast. Everything else would be wrought. Notice the decoration, the lyre, the harp inside these designs that you see, which was common, very expressive, very beautiful. There's that church at St. Michael's Church in South Carolina. Obviously an urn detail here, which is really wonderful. Cast medallions on these corners. But that's been there 250 years, out exposed like that. Speaks to the quality of the wrought iron. I think that would have rotted by now if that was steel. But the early wrought iron was amazing stuff. I'm not an ironwork expert. I just have a huge appreciation of it. There's a thing called repoussé. Repoussé is, if you saw my video that we did on the build show on that house in the stairway, this little leaf, the little water leaf detail here is repoussé. And basically what they would do is this was all wrought and welded and made together. But then these pieces are hand hammered. And so you see it here where this leaf comes off, and all this dainty stuff here is repoussé. And it's a way of, it's very French, right? That's always a French word, but it's a way of expressing a little bit more, of giving this a little bit more life, that you actually have a leaf that kind of flips around and changes. So it's quite wonderful. And when you think of cast iron, I think of, ranch houses with the railings around the entry of the house. But cast, this is 1850s, I think, in South Carolina. This is all cast iron here, all these pieces are. And as you go further away from that 1820, early era, you get away from the wrought iron, and most of the stuff begins to be cast iron. This is a beautiful example of wrought and cast iron. With the beautiful arrows and kind of and that's just such a pretty design, but a combination of cast and wrought, mostly wrought after that time. And then of course New Orleans, where you're so used to seeing this down in the French Quarter. A lot of this is cast, a lot of it has been replaced, but still very beautiful and typical in that era. Beautiful church design there.
Is there like a way they're coming up with scale as far as laying these details out within gates or fences or that sort of thing for the specific designs that are being brought in?
So there were design books that were used. He asked about where the design came from, basically.
Or even how they proportionate the scale based upon like the size of gate or something. So if you go back one, you have your van detail in this bottom third. So maybe that's 12 inches wide versus.
I think he's asking kind of where the scale came from, and I think it's the same way where scale and proportion come from a door. That it's pretty typical that a door style is 5 inches or 4 inches, and that is because it's something that's stood up over time that we know that we have to build at that size or it'll fall apart. And I believe the same thing is true of this ironwork, is that it had to be a certain gauge in order to hold the weight and to manage that. And then the other pieces are designed accordingly based off that frame. But I don't know the exact answer to your question. And then final slide here, just kind of the magic in Charleston. And then, these are shutter dogs. These are for the shutters. Basically, when the shutter opens against the wall, this shutter dog is weighted, like this end of it weighs more than this. So it always falls down and stands up, right? And I have to say, this is a public service announcement, because it drives me crazy when people have a shutter on their house and here's their shutter and they've got the shutter dog up here. Drives me nuts, okay? And you see it wedged in there so it'll stay there, because it won't stay there, right? It wants to fall down straight. That shutter dog goes right here, okay? And the bottom portion of it is weighted so that it holds the shutter, so the shutter can't blow open, okay? So this was a public service announcement. That's why this end's longer than this end. That's why this weighs more than this, so that there could be weighted and so that it can hold the shutter open using gravity, and it therefore lasts longer. So that's my public service announcement. Yeah, exactly. You take one lesson away. All right, so Greek Revival, obviously this Greek temple front is a strong design idea. It is neoclassical, it's evolving from the French, that strong temple front. We begin to see the rise of the architect. We're going to talk more about the architect and kind of his role. And these are buildings and bridges. This is about building. This is how building happens. And we need to realize that design starts getting pulled away here. And then the rise of the modern city is something we're also going to study, because New York, as it grows in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and as the cities grow and the civic architecture is needed, it changes the kind of building, and builders like me end up building houses and not commercial buildings. because of all this change. And that happens and starts right here. The next one, November 16th, 2 months from now.
18.
Is it? 18th, that's what I said. November 18th. We're going to talk about Victorian building. My wife hates the name of this. We're going to come up with a sexier name. But please join us then. Any other questions? Thank you guys for sitting through this. And please come look at these books. They're awesome.